if you want to strengthen African-American owned businesses, you have to get money into the hands of African-American consumers.
Do you believe in reparations?
Yeah, so I 100% agree with the moral case for reparations. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's clear that this country was built on the backs of slaves. And so the question is, what can we get done as a society to help try and make that right? When in reality, there's really nothing anyone can do that can make that right. Like, you can't go back and undo, decades of like subjugation and inhumanity. There's no dollar amount you could be like, and like everything is now copacetic.
It's not going to make it better, but it'll make people feel a little bit better.
and I'm a numbers guy, and I agree that like, reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' analysis, if you were to put a number on it, that number would be enormous, like rightfully so.
So is slavery and white supremacy, right?
Exactly. Like, if you were to put a number on it, the number is like, like in the trillions, realistically. Because then if you look at that dollar amount and then grow it over time and extrapolate it. So the question is, how do we get started? And what I'm going to suggest is the way we get started is we put $1,000 a month into everyone's hands. That would be literally hundreds of billions of dollars in the hands of African Americans every single year.
We get that. So
and then at that point, then you start looking and saying, okay, what more can we do? But you start with something that will disproportionately help people of color.
Not people of color, black people.
Yes.
Let's stick to black people. And you agree with the moral argument.
Yes.
Do you agree with a practical economic plan that will carry out some form of reparations, whatever it may be, for black people?
I believe that we need to move in that direction as fast as possible, yes.
Do you think soon that you will come up with a plan of what that could potentially look like?
Well, so I have some policy proposals that are specifically directed at strengthening, the black community.
Tell us more.
So one is that if you look at historically black colleges and universities, the problem in our educational system is that it makes more sense to cater to people that have lots of money that can pay you and then donate afterwards.
Sure.
Meanwhile, HBCUs have been incredibly successful at elevating the paths of hundreds of thousands of African Americans, and a lot of those schools are now struggling because they're serving a group that doesn't necessarily have the means to come back and donate a ton. So the federal government needs to step in and say, look, we need to shore up the endowments of these historically black colleges and universities that have been awesomely successful and been pillars of our country for decades in many cases, because this is something where the market will not suffice.
The problem is that there are plenty of black folk who have all types of degrees and they can't find jobs, right? So that goes back to the reparations question. Investing in education does not necessarily equal being able to get into the workforce. Is there anything else that has an economic incentive that will repay black people for the economic racism that we have endured for hundreds of years?
Yes. So the way I agree with you that at this point, getting a degree does not ensure a stable livelihood afterwards. I mean, the underemployment rate for recent college graduates in this country is 44%, and that's across everyone. And so that rate's
sure
probably
black people are far worse.
Yeah, it's probably even higher. Yeah, it's probably even higher. So that is one thing that I believe we have to try and adjust to, is like, if someone's like, hey, education, 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 the fact is, like, you get a degree now, like, you might just have this giant debt load and no job at the end of it. So the next big move we have to make is we just have to start putting $1,000 a month into everyone's hands, that then ends up really diversifying people's options. Because a lot of people go into various higher education programs because they feel like that's like their only secure path forward. And then they wind up with a debt load and it may or may not work out. Whereas if you're putting $12,000 a year into people's hands, then like how many more entrepreneurs would there be? How many more artists and creatives would there be? How many more people would be able to chart a different sort of path for themselves that's not dependent necessarily upon a degree or credential?